Picture this. You're a Persian princess. It's the 16th century, the height of the Safavid Empire. You've been dressed in layers of silk and gold thread for hours. Your attendants have applied henna to your hands in intricate patterns. Each swirl and curve a signal to the groom that you're his now, painted like property, like goods delivered. Your mother came to you this morning with eyes that couldn't quite meet yours. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. She just gripped your wrist, hard enough to leave marks, and whispered one word: survive. You don't fully understand what she means. Not yet. Tonight, you'll understand. Because in a few hours, when the wedding celebrations end and the crowds fade away, you'll be alone with a man you've never spoken to. A man you might have glimpsed once, twice, across a courtyard, but never spoken with, never known. And what happens in that room, behind those doors, with only servants and guards standing outside, could change everything. For some Persian princesses, the wedding night was a gateway to power. For others, it was a threshold into terror. If you're drawn to these dark corners of history where empire meets intimacy, where politics infiltrate the bedroom, where women's lives hung on the decisions of men in distant palaces, hit that like button and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I'm genuinely curious about where these stories travel around the world. Now let me take you back to Safavid Persia, to a world where marriage wasn't about love or even companionship. It was geopolitics. It was dynastic survival. It was the collision of a girl's body with a nation's ambitions. The Safavid Empire controlled the vital crossroads between East and West. Persian silk flowed to Europe. Spices moved north and south. Armies marched through deserts. And at the center of it all, managing this impossible balance, the royal court, where every marriage was a strategic calculation. Princesses weren't humans with futures. They were assets, like gold in a vault, like horses in a stable, like weapons in an armory. A princess could be married to cement an alliance with a neighboring kingdom. She could be given to a noble to secure his loyalty. She could be betrothed to an ambassador's son to smooth relations with a distant court. She could be married to her own cousin to keep power within the family, to prevent the dilution of what Safavid rulers considered divine blood. And once a princess was married, she belonged to her husband's household. She left her father's palace, her mother's protection, her family's sphere of influence. She entered an unknown world governed by an unknown woman, the mother-in-law, who now had complete authority over her. The wedding itself was celebration and transferal simultaneously. Drums beat for days. Dancers moved through the courtyards. Gold and jewels were displayed, a visible account of the bride's dowry, a statement to everyone watching about her family's wealth and status. The groom was brought to the wedding with ceremony and music, lifted onto the shoulders of servants, honored, celebrated. And the bride was prepared, secluded, covered, transformed into an object of display and desire in equal measure. The night before her wedding, a Persian princess typically underwent a ritual purification, Ion. She was bathed in water perfumed with rose and jasmine. Her entire body was hair removed using sugaring, an ancient technique where heated sugar paste is applied and torn away from the skin. This wasn't described as painful. This was described as necessary, as beautifying, as preparing her for her husband. The message was clear and brutal. Your body is not yours. It belongs to the household you're marrying into. It must be modified, refined, prepared according to their standards. There were also herbal treatments applied to her skin, mixtures meant to soften it, to make her more appealing. Attendants would file her nails, polish them with dyes. They'd oil her hair with fragrant compounds. They'd pluck and shape her eyebrows according to the fashion of the court. For hours, sometimes an entire day, her body was treated as a canvas for someone else's aesthetic vision. It was grooming. It was preparation. It was a complete erasure of her former self in favor of a version that someone else had constructed for her. Some princesses were young when they married, 12, 13, 14. too young to fully understand what their body was being prepared for. Some were older, in their 20s, which in that era was considered practically ancient for a bride. A woman in her 20s was damaged goods, a princess who'd been passed over, who'd failed to marry earlier, who perhaps had disappointed her father somehow. These women carried shame in addition to fear. By the time you reach your wedding night, you've heard whispers from the older women. You know stories. You know that some princesses emerged from their first night marked, bruised, traumatized in ways that your society refuses to name but everyone understands. You know that some princesses came to your mother's quarters the next morning moving stiffly, pain evident in every step. You know that your own mother had been a princess once, and when you asked her what to expect, what it would be like, she just closed her eyes and said, "It will be what it is." That phrase haunted you. It will be what it is. Resignation, acceptance, the vocabulary of someone who had no choice. The wedding night protocols in Safavid Persia were, on the surface, carefully regulated. There were witnesses, specifically, attendants of the groom's mother, who waited outside the bedroom to verify that the marriage was consummated. Virginity wasn't just expected, it was verifiable, inspectable. A bride's value depended on her bloodlessness, on the idea that no other man had touched her, that her body was fundamentally untouched, pristine property. Sometimes, to ensure legitimacy, a physician would examine the bride beforehand, checking her hymen, certifying her virginity like a stamp on an official document. The entire society was obsessed with this one physical marker, this thin membrane, as if the presence or absence of it determined not just honor, but a woman's entire moral character. After the couple retreated to the wedding chamber, after the door closed and the candles were lit, what happened was theoretically between them, but the witnesses outside knew everything. They listened for specific sounds, cries of pain that indicated resistance being overcome. Sounds of physical intimacy that proved the husband was doing his duty. The number and volume of sounds mattered. A silent consummation might raise questions. After a designated time, often just minutes, the witnesses would be given a sign. Blood from the wedding night would be shown as proof of the bride's virginity. A white cloth would be displayed, often from an upper window or balcony, visible to servants and members of both families who'd been waiting. Without this proof, without the bloodstain on the white cloth, catastrophe could follow. The bride could be accused of being used goods, of arriving not a virgin but a deceiver. Her family's honor would be questioned. Her husband's family might reject her, send her back, or worse. Some historical accounts suggest that brides who didn't bleed on their wedding night were subjected to physical examination by the groom's mother and attendants, invasive inspections to determine if they were truly virgins or if something had gone wrong. The pressure was immense. You had to bleed. If you didn't bleed naturally, you had to hope the physical pain of your first experience would cause bleeding. If that didn't happen, you faced social catastrophe. Some desperate brides carried animal blood hidden in their clothing, planning to produce it if nature didn't cooperate. Some used a technique involving thorn pricks to their inner thighs to ensure bleeding. Some prayed desperately to God or the saints to let their bodies betray them naturally so they wouldn't have to create false evidence. The fear of this ritual wasn't just about modesty or discomfort, it was about survival. Failure could mean being cast out, returned to your family in disgrace, marked as damaged forever. No one would marry you again. Your marriage prospects dead, your family's reputation damaged by association. And if you were a princess, if your family had invested considerable power in this alliance, the consequences of failure were exponentially worse. Your father might be furious enough to withdraw support from alliances, to start wars over the insult to his family's honor. Your mother would face shame within the harem. Your younger sister's marriage prospects would be damaged. One failed wedding night could reverberate through generations, but the wedding night fear went deeper than even the virginity test. It was fear of what came after, because consummating the marriage was only the beginning. Once a princess was married, she entered a household where she had almost no rights. She was subject to her husband's authority, absolutely. he could take other wives. Islamic tradition permitted up to 4 wives, and many Persian nobles exercised this right enthusiastically. A princess who expected to be her husband's only wife could find herself sharing him with multiple women, all of whom had equal or greater claim on his attention, his resources, his body. The jealousy could be poisonous. Women competing for the husband's favor, for access to resources, for the privilege of bearing his children. Alliances would form between co-wives, conspiracies would develop. A princess might poison a rival wife's food, or at least suspect it. She might find herself locked out of her husband's chambers while another wife entertained him. She might watch as a younger, prettier, more fertile wife displaced her entirely. And some husbands were brutal. There were historical accounts of princesses who were beaten by their husbands, women from the most powerful families in the empire suffering physical abuse in the privacy of their marital chambers because their husbands had the right to discipline them, to correct their behavior, to enforce obedience. A husband could beat his wife, and it wasn't legally classified as a crime. There were princesses who became pregnant almost immediately, their bodies ravaged by pregnancies before they were physically mature enough to bear children safely. There were princesses who lost children in childbirth, who hemorrhaged to death, while attendants stood outside forbidden from entering. Respecting the modesty of the marital chamber, even as the princess died, there were princesses who were infected with diseases by husbands who'd had relations with servants or other women, diseases that spread within the household, causing miscarriages and suffering. The fear of the wedding night was partly fear of the act itself, the physical pain of first intercourse, the vulnerability, the loss of bodily autonomy. But it was also fear of everything that would follow, fear that this one night would lock her into a situation from which there was no escape. Once married, a princess could rarely divorce. The Quran permitted divorce, but cultural norms and family pressure made it nearly impossible for a woman of status. She was trapped. In those few hours before her wedding night, a Persian princess might have gone through emotions that modern language has diffic, capturing. Terror, yes, but also resignation, acceptance, a kind of numb surrendering to the inevitable. Her attendants tried to prepare her with practical advice. Don't resist too much, they might whisper, because resistance causes pain, but also don't seem too willing, because a wife who appears too experienced or enthusiastic will be suspected of previous relations. The balance was impossible. Be somehow virgin and willing simultaneously. Be passive, but not too passive. Be desirable, but not desiring. Be available, but not enthusiastic. Be everything contradictory. Some princesses were given herbal preparations to drink. Teas brewed from ingredients meant to relax them, to reduce pain. Some were given wine to dull the fear, though alcohol was officially forbidden in Islam, which meant these preparations were given in secret, adding another layer of transgression to the night. Some were simply told to think of God, to pray, to accept this as their duty to their family and their nation. One Persian princess, recorded in history, oracle accounts, reportedly spent her entire wedding night praying, ignoring her new husband's advances entirely. The account claims she maintained silence and closed her eyes, essentially disassociating from the experience, treating it as an ordeal to be endured rather than something she participated in. Her husband was furious, but forced to accept it. She never conceived. Whether she couldn't conceive due to the traumatic circumstances or due to psychological factors, or whether she secretly took measures to prevent pregnancy, history doesn't record. What's recorded is that she lived in her husband's household for 20 years, never bearing children, never fully integrating into the family, existing in a state of cold civility. She became something of a legend among the women of the court, the princess who refused. But refusing came with a price. Her daughter's marriage prospects were damaged by association. She was never fully accepted into her husband's family. She lived surrounded by people who resented her for the scandal of her childlessness, for her implicit rejection of her marital duty. And yet, she survived. She wasn't killed. She wasn't sent back to her father's household. In some ways, her refusal became its own form of power. though power purchased at an enormous cost. There were other princesses whose wedding nights went differently. Some discovered that their husbands were kind, at least as much as men in that society could be. Some found that their fear diminished with familiarity, that the act became routine, even occasionally pleasurable. Some became pregnant and devoted themselves to motherhood, finding agency in producing heirs, in their children becoming their sphere of influence. Some princesses rose from the bedroom to positions of significant power. Mothers of future kings often wielded tremendous influence over their sons. A princess who gave birth to a prince might find her status elevated dramatically. She went from being her husband's possession to being the mother of potentially the next emperor. These women could wield power from behind the throne, advising their sons, managing the harem, controlling the flow of information and wealth. But achieving this required surviving the wedding night, required conceiving a child, specifically a son, required navigating the treacherous politics of a household where multiple wives competed for favor and influence. The fear of the wedding night was partly fear of what would happen in that single night. But it was also fear of a lifetime, fear of a future that stretched ahead without the possibility of escape or control, fear that a single moment of physical vulnerability would define decades of your existence, fear that your body, given to a stranger, would determine everything about your life. And the worst part was that this fear was completely legitimate. For many Persian princesses, the wedding night did mark the beginning of a confined, controlled, often painful existence. They were expected to bear children until their bodies wore out from repeated pregnancies. They were expected to manage intricate household politics while having almost no formal authority. They were expected to be obedient, pious, grateful for the privilege of their position, while being stripped of virtually all agency. Some survived by becoming powerful in their own right, navigating the system skillfully. Some survived by withdrawing entirely, becoming almost ghost-like presences in the household, unthreatening enough to be left largely alone. Some didn't survive at all. There are records of princesses who died within a few years of marriage, either from complications of childbirth or from illnesses that modern interpretation suggests might have been psychological, physical manifestations of their trapped circumstances. One particularly tragic account involves a princess who was married at 14 to a man 30 years her senior. She conceived within months, but lost the baby at 6 months. She became pregnant again immediately after. During her second pregnancy, she developed an infection. Despite the best efforts of physicians and attendants, the infection worsened. She died during labor, along with her child. She was 16 years old. Her body couldn't handle the repeated trauma of pregnancy and miscarriage so close together. The fear of her wedding night, which likely paled compared to the medical horror that followed, had been just the beginning. But what strikes the modern reader is that no one in her society seemed to view this as tragic in the sense we might. She'd done her duty. She'd attempted to produce an heir. That she died in the process was regrettable, but ultimately the cost of her social position. She wasn't mourned as a girl who'd been destroyed by circumstances. She was mourned as a wife who'd failed to provide sons. Another princess, married at 19, reportedly spent 3 years in her husband's household without conceiving. Each month that her period came was viewed as a failure. Each empty womb was an indictment of her fertility. Physicians gave her tonics. Women whispered advice about positions and prayers. Her husband took a second wife, younger, with better breeding prospects. The original princess was essentially set aside, living in the household but increasingly irrelevant. She eventually convinced her family to arrange her return to her father's palace, claiming illness, claiming she needed her mother's care. She spent the rest of her life there, never remarried, her failure to produce children defining her entire existence. So why did Persian princesses fear their wedding night? Because it represented the loss of their girlhood, the beginning of sexual availability, the start of repeated pregnancies, the entrance into a household where they had almost no authority. The wedding night was the moment when the abstract future became concrete, when possibility collapsed into certainty. You thought maybe it would be different, maybe you would be lucky, Maybe your husband would be kind. Maybe your marriage would be bearable. But the moment you crossed the threshold into that bedroom, you knew. This was it. This was real. This was your life now. The fear itself was sometimes worse than the reality. The anticipation, the dread, the uncertainty. Some princesses reported that the actual experience was less traumatic than they'd feared. Others reported the opposite, the reality vastly exceeding their nightmares. But all of them faced the same fundamental truth. Their lives were no longer their own, and the wedding night was where that truth became undeniable. So who were these Persian princesses really? They were girls forced into adulthood in a single night. They were women whose value was measured by the sons they produced. They were strategists who had to navigate household politics despite having almost no official power. They were sometimes victims of physical violence, sometimes partners in political maneuvering with their husbands. Sometimes they became powerful in their own right through the influence their children granted them. Sometimes they were forgotten within a generation, relegated to historical footnotes. Their wedding night fear reveals something fundamental about the system they lived in, about what it meant to be a woman in a patriarchal empire, about what it meant to have your body belong to the state, your reproductive capacity assigned to serve national interests, your entire existence justified only if you produced the right heirs. The fear was rational. It was justified. It reflected an accurate understanding of what marriage would cost them. In modern context, we might frame this as abuse, as coercion, as a system designed to remove agency from women. And in many ways, we'd be correct. But within the context of Safavid Persia, it was simply life. It was what happened to all girls who had the misfortune of being born royal. The wedding night they feared was often just the beginning of a much longer story, sometimes a nightmare, sometimes an unexpected life, sometimes an avenue to unexpected power. The complexity of their experiences defies simple categorization. They were victims of a system, yes, but within that system, many exercised whatever agency they could find. They became powerful. They influenced empire. They shaped the future through their sons. Some became known as the power behind the throne, whispering in the ear of kings, controlling the distribution of resources, determining which sons would inherit which territories. But they had to survive the wedding night first. They had to endure that threshold. They had to cross from girlhood into womanhood in a single night, under circumstances completely beyond their control, in the arms of strangers, in the service of empires, with only their courage and whatever strategies the older women had taught them. Their mothers had only one piece of advice to give them: survive. That was the only real goal. Not happiness, not fulfillment, not even dignity in many cases. Survival. And many of them did survive. They lived decades in their husbands' households. They bore children. They influenced courts. They accumulated power however they could. They died eventually and were mostly forgotten, their names disappearing from official records, their accomplishments absorbed into their sons' legacies. But their story, the fear they felt on their wedding nights, the circumstances that made that fear not just reasonable but inevitable, that story still echoes through history. It reminds us that what we consider progress, what we consider human rights, what we consider basic autonomies, these things are fragile and recent. They remind us that in other places, other times, women had almost none of what we take for granted. And they remind us that many of those women still found ways to live, to influence, to matter, despite everything.